Hello children, here I am with my tutorial on the portrait of a lady written by Khushwant Singh, an Indian novelist, lawyer, journalist and politician. He was conferred with Padma Bhushan in 1974, but he returned the award in 1984 in protest against Operation Blue Star, in which the Indian Army raided Amritsar. Later, in 2007, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, the second highest civilian award in India. The portrait of a lady is part of an autobiography by Khushwant Singh, in which he draws a pen portrait of his grandmother. He beautifully unfolds their relationship and how it undergoes several changes. But before we begin, let's have a look at the pictures on the screen and understand what they are trying to say. The author begins by recalling his grandmother. He had known her for the past 20 years and she had always been old and wrinkled. He was told that she had once been young and pretty and had a husband. But it was hard for the author to believe this. Or, in other words, the thought was almost revolting. His grandfather's portrait hung on the wall, in which he wore loose-fitted clothes, a turban, and a long white beard that reached his chest. He too appeared very old, and the author thought that he was someone who could only have many grandchildren, but not a wife or children. The grandmother always shared her childhood memories, like the games she used to play as a child, but for the author and his cousins, these stories were illogical, as it was beyond their imagination to think grandmother to be a child playing such games. They thought that her life stories were just like other moral stories which she used to narrate to them. Describing his grandmother, the author says that she was short, fat, slightly bent in posture, and her face had lots and lots of wrinkles. She walked around the house in an awkward way, wearing spotless white clothes, with one hand resting on her waist, balancing her stoop, and the other busy counting the beads of the rosary. Her lips always moved in inaudible prayers. Her silvery white hair lay scattered over her wrinkled face. For the author, his grandmother was never pretty, but she reflected divine beauty. The author here compares her beauty to the winter landscape of mountains, which is surrounded by peace and serenity. Thus, the grandmother, in her spotless white attire, with silvery white hair, represented the perfect example of pure white peace-emitting entity. Describing his childhood, the author says that he lived with his grandmother in the village. Both were good friends, and his parents left him with her to settle in the city. As a daily routine, the author's grandmother would wake him up and get him ready for school. She would recite her morning prayers in a sing-song manner while she bathed and dressed him in the hope that he would learn them by heart. Instead, the author listened to the prayers as he loved her voice, but never bothered to learn them. She would make his things ready, like a wooden slate, earthen ink pot, and a red pen. He would eat a thick stale chapati with butter and sugar on it, and together they would set to school. Reaching the school, on one side the author would sit with other children, sing the alphabet and prayers in chorus. On the other side, his grandmother would sit in the temple adjoining the school, reading scriptures. After finishing, on their way back, they would feed the stale chapatis to the dogs. Now, when author's parents got settled in the city, they called them too. Thus came a turning point in the relationship of Khushwant Singh and his grandmother. As the author and his grandmother shifted to the city, a turning point came in their relationship. In the city, author and his grandmother shared the same room, but she could no longer accompany him to school. He started going to an English medium school, and a motor bus would come to pick and drop him. Also, there were no dogs to feed on the streets, and so the grandmother took to feeding sparrows in the veranda of their house. As the years passed in the city, their interaction reduced. For some time, she continued to wake him up and would get him ready for school. She would eagerly ask him what he had learned in school that day. But the scientific terminologies and English words made her unhappy. This was the reason that even after being interested, as she didn't know the language, she could not help him with the lessons. This inability left her distressed. Adding on to the fact, the new school never taught the author about God and religious scriptures, and this too made her sad. She did not approve of such education. One day, the author happily came home and declared that he was given music lessons. The grandmother's sorrow and anxiety knew no bounds when she came face to face with this fact. According to her, music was indecent and it was an art for beggars and prostitutes, and not for those belonging to decent families. She was extremely disturbed after knowing this fact, and in order to display her dislike and disapproval, she stopped talking to the author from that day. By now, the author had grown up and he started going to university. Now he was given a room of his own, and this marked the end of the common link of the friendship between the author and his grandmother. After grandmother had stopped conversing with her grandson, the only thing common in their relationship was the room. But not anymore. With changing times, the grandmother became lonely and her interactions reduced to minimum. But she silently accepted her loneliness and seclusion. Now the grandmother spent her whole day at the spinning wheel and reciting her prayers. In the afternoon, she used to feed sparrows in the veranda. Breaking the bread into small pieces, she would feed hundreds of sparrows. The birds would gather around her. Some sat near her, some on her legs, some on her palm, some on her shoulders, and few even on her head. She never shooed them. Instead, she smiled. She was the happiest in that half hour during the whole day. Now came the time when the author decided to go abroad for 5 long years. He bore the notion in his mind that maybe it would be the last time he would see her, as he would be gone for 5 years. He was certain that the grandmother would be upset at his departure. But the grandmother, as usual, didn't display any emotion. She came to the station to see him off, emotionless and expressionless. She was still absorbed in praying and telling the beads of the rosary. Finally, she held the author and silently kissed his forehead. The author thought that perhaps it was the last sign of physical contact between them. But he was wrong. On returning back after 5 years, he found his grandmother at the station. She looked just the way she did 5 years ago, not a day older. Again, without any display of any emotion, she held him in her arms. He could still hear her reciting prayers. And even that day, the happiest moment for the grandmother was not the one in which her grandson had arrived, but the moment that she spent feeding the sparrows in the afternoon turned out to be the happiest for her. However, something strange happened to her in the evening. She did not follow her regular routine of praying. Instead, she collected a few women from the neighborhood, got an old drum, and started singing. She thumped the ruined part of the drum and sang songs of the homecoming of warriors. The whole family persuaded her to stop, as she might fall ill due to exertion. But she did not listen to anyone. Next day, she was diagnosed with mild fever. But grandmother knew very well that her end was near. Strangely, she declared that she did not want to talk to anyone and would rather spend her last moments praying. The family continuously protested, but she ignored. She lay peacefully on her bed, chanting prayers and telling her rosary. After a short while, she stopped and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A calm, pale appearance spread over her face and she was dead. The family lifted her from the bed, laid her on the ground, and wrapped her with a red-colored cloth. Then their eyes met a strange sight. Hundreds of sparrows sat all over their veranda without chirruping. It appeared as if they too were mourning her death. The author's mother fetched some breadcrumbs for the birds, but they didn't eat any. Then they flew away as the family carried the dead body. Next morning, the sweeper swept away the breadcrumbs into the dustbin. In this way, the sparrows paid their tribute to the one who had fed them for so many years.